everyone, and thank you for coming to the library to spend President's Day with us. We are going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Nixon's trip to China. Dr. Melvin Barnes Jr. from OSU is going to provide us with an intriguing and insightful talk about how President Nixon's visit to China in February 1972 transformed U.S. Chinese relations, how they have progressed since then, and the current state of relations between the two countries. Dr. Barnes is a teacher scholar specializing in Eastern Asian, transnational, and African American history. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Toledo and his PhD from OSU. His research explores race in East Asia, extending beyond national boundaries. So now I will pass this on to Dr. Barnes, and I'm sure we're going to have a very informative, interesting talk. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? All right, yeah, I think I hear myself, so I think we're good to go. So today we're going to have our talk, which the title is Revolution and Rapprochement. And obviously this is about the 50th anniversary of Nixon's visit to China. So this is going to be a really sort of informal talk about the long arc of the history to that moment, and then sort of where we've come since that moment. And, you know, all of us here, we're Americans, I think, assuming. So what I'm going to do today is really focus a little bit more on sort of bridging that Chinese side of how they got there and meeting sort of where Nixon and how the US arrived at that particular moment. So we're here to talk about one week that changed the world. And that week was February 21st until February 28th, 1972. And on the left, you can see Nixon arriving in Beijing. And on the right, you see him shaking hands with Zhou Enlai. And for anyone who remembers sort of the relations at that time, this was a very monumental moment. You didn't see heads of state from the United States visiting the People's Republic of China. Now, when we finish with the talk today, I think that there's going to be three sort of questions and major takeaways that I think each of you will be able to walk away from this talk with an answer to and an understanding of. So the first one is, what were Sino-US relations like before 1972? What was the significance of Nixon's visit to China? And finally, how have relations evolved since 1972? And I tried pretty hard to think of one word where I could sort of distill and explain the relationship between China and the United States, you know, really over the past 150 years, dating back to the late 19th century. And the best word that I could come up with is frenemy. So not really quite friends and not really quite enemies. China and the US are somewhere firmly in the frenemy space, on again, off again, friends. But to understand where the significance is for that 1972 meeting, we have to start by looking at the relationship after 1949. And that relationship after 1949 was really predominantly defined by the enemy side of that relationship or that coin. And this is an image of a Chinese soldier fighting in Korea, which we'll talk about a little bit more later in the talk. But to understand how China and the United States became enemies, we have to go back to the sort of outbreak of the Cold War. Everyone knows that before the 1990s, you know, we had that state of hostilities between the Soviet Union and the United States that, you know, was called the Cold War. And we all grew up underneath that sort of political situation. Now, the Cold War begins. Many of us sort of date the Cold War back to 1947 and Truman's announcement of the Truman Doctrines. And in that doctrine, he sort of spelled out how the United States wanted to contain communism after World War II. Now, initially, the Truman Doctrine is focused on containing communism in Europe, but it eventually spreads to include containing communism in Asia. If any of you have heard that sort of term domino theory, you know that it means that the idea was that, first communism would spread from the Soviet Union or Russia into other parts of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. But the same sort of theory applied in East Asia, that communism would spread from the Soviet Union, Russia, into China, into Korea, eventually Japan, and then before you know it, the United States is a communist country. So the Truman Doctrine outlined the US's efforts to contain and eventually roll back communism. Now, the People's Republic of China is established sort of right in the midst of those early years of the Cold War. And when the People's Republic of China was established, the Chinese Communist Party had a decision to make. They had to decide, would they support the Soviet Union or would they support the United States? Now, I think for many of us, we may think that that choice seems pretty obvious. Of course, they're going to support the Soviet Union, but it wasn't necessarily that obvious at the time. During the Chinese Civil War, which had raged from the late 1920s into the 1940s, which pitted the Chinese Communist Party against the Chinese Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang by its Chinese name, the US actually had taken time to sort of look at how they can build relationships with the Chinese Communist Party as well, because they felt that the Chinese Communist Party was more effective as a fighting force and as an administrator than the Nationalist Party at times. So here on the left, you can see this, this image, which is a piece of propaganda that was put out in the early 1950s. And for those of you who are sort of still up on your Chinese language skills, what it says is 中苏两国人民友谊万岁. So what that means is long live the friendship between the Chinese and the Soviet peoples. And in 1950, in February, China and the Soviet Union sign an agreement known as the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. And Mao explains that the new country, the PRC, would lean to one side. And by that one side, what they meant was the Soviet Union, as opposed to the United States. Now, many of the sort of political scientists who analyze the Cold War often talk about a strategic triangle. So at the top, or really you can put this in any order, but you have the United States, the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China. When China decides to lean to one side, right, that means that China and the Soviet Union are establishing closer ties. And in this sort of concept, that means that the United States is at a strategic disadvantage. And this sort of relationship is going to be what defines the sort of early interactions between China and the United States. Now, from the very beginning, China and the United States were in a very antagonistic position. So on October 1st, 1949, as I mentioned before, the PRC is established. Within 1 year, you have the outbreak of the Korean War. And China enters that war in November of 1950. And this really changes the tide of the conflict. You know, the United States and the UN forces had really pushed the North Koreans all the way back to the Yalu River. But when the Chinese People's Volunteers entered into the conflict, they completely changed the battle, forced the US and UN forces all the way back down the peninsula. And then they had to fight their way back, and they settled sort of with the current lines that divide North and South Korea today. But it was a very sort of harsh conflict, not only for the US, but also for China. Now, we call it the Korean War, but in China, the conflict is known as 抗美援朝, which means the war to resist America and aid Korea. And this is where you start to have some of those first early images of the United States produced in the PRC. So there's some themes that run through these representations of the United States in those early years. Now, one of the first things that we see is discussions of the US as a country that uses biological weapons against not only the Chinese people, but the North Korean people as well. So again, for those of us, or those of you who are still hip on your Chinese, the characters here is Xi Jun, which means bacteria. And this is obviously an American who's kind of got these infested animals all around him. And the idea was that the United States was dropping, bombs that contained, rats and fleas that all carried diseases into Northern Korea and Manchuria. Now, this conflict produces a series of books and posters that are all about explaining to the Chinese people who or what the United States is. Now, this is really interesting because if you think about back to your history and World War II, China and the United States actually fought on the same side of that conflict. And China and the United States cooperated heavily to defeat the Empire of Japan. Now, for people who sort of woke up on October 2nd, 1949, they didn't necessarily have all of the sort of inner thinking of the Chinese Communist Party already built in, right? They had to be taught to think and see the countries, in different ways than they had before. So you've got to change how Chinese people throughout the country had looked at the United States for the previous however many years. So you have a book. This one is called 这就是美国, which means this is America. And through these materials, you have a number of themes that run through. One theme is sort of the United States as the continuation of Japanese imperialism. So if you look here, you have the U.S. serviceman who is helping the Japanese soldier move from Japan to Korea and eventually on to China. And here you can see the sort of role of the troops sort of pushing the US out of Korea. And this is significant, right? Because what you're doing is you're tying that image of the United States to sort of what was previously China's mortal enemy, right? So this is setting up for people to think that, hey, in the 1950s and into the 1960s, the United States is China's chief sort of enemy. They also describe the US as sort of capitalist warmongers during World War II. And these are images also from these books. And on the left, you can see US servicemen attacking a rickshaw driver, presumably sometime during or just after the Second World War. Here you see US servicemen firing their guns and killing a Chinese man, again, during the war. And this is sort of a sort of image of the US marching into, different parts of the country. And I think this is actually most likely Shanghai. But overall, one of the other big themes was depictions of the United States as sort of irredeemably or rapaciously racist, right? So this is another image pulled from those books where you can see depictions of the Klan and a lynching located somewhere in the South. And this is actually an image that is sort of covering the US president, President Truman. And they describe him sort of, going from work to the Klansman to here, he's sort of the puppet of capitalist, and he's cracking the whip at these American workers. And one other big point of tension that's tied to this is you have US dissidents who are traveling to China during the 1950s and into the 1960s, who are also sort of helping to sort of support or underline some of these issues, right? These are people who in the United States were not able to sort of find justice, so they traveled to other parts of the world where they were more welcome and better received. So one of the first people was W.E.B. Du Bois, who traveled to China in 1959. And here you can see him meeting with Mao Zedong. But he wasn't the last. You also had Robert F. Williams traveling to China in 1963. And he would also return to China to live there temporarily from 1966 until 1969. Williams is famous for sort of calling on African Americans to take up arms in defense of their communities. And he's eventually forced to flee the United States, where he ends up in Cuba and then eventually in China, pictured here meeting with Mao. So all of these things are sort of intertwined, right? And even here in 1968, this is a poster that was produced when Mao made his second proclamation in support of the African American freedom struggle. The first one was in 1963. This one is in 1968. And what it's showing is all of the sort of racial uprisings and riots that took place during the 1960s. So that decade of the 60s is often characterized as a decade of long, hot summers where you have a lot of uprisings in urban centers. And these were uprisings that Chinese people were watching fairly closely. And this sort of starts to build a picture of the United States in the Chinese imagination of the 1950s. And the way that I would describe that as being overwhelmingly defined by sort of this enemy antagonistic antagonism. So that brings us to a question, right? How do we go from the US as being China's mortal enemy in the 1950s and the 1960s to being friends sometime, in the 1970s and 1980s? And that is a story that you have to talk about domestic Chinese politics and how those things interact with international politics. So to begin with, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the domestic influences that lead us to Nixon's visit in 1972. We'll start there. So a lot of us usually think of Mao as being a dictator who had very few limits, if any, on his power. But really, it wasn't exactly true to view him that way. Mao sometimes ran afoul of his party, and sometimes there was tension there. So in 1959, 1962, Mao launches what is known as the Great Leap Forward. And he does this, right? And I'll explain to you what that is in just a moment. So in the early years, typically communist states, they operate their economy based on 5-year plans. So in 1953, the Chinese Communist Party starts their first 5-year plan. Basically, you set some goals that you're trying to hit in 5 years for the economy. And they focused on heavy industry. And that first 5-year plan worked out pretty well. Heavy industry grew at a really fast rate. The urban centers were really starting to benefit from those heavy industries. But there's one really big problem for Mao. Mao had come to power on the back of not a sort of typical communist revolution that takes place in cities. He'd come to power on the back of an agrarian revolution. And as those sort of urban centers and industries really did well, he felt that the countryside, where the revolution had been sort of played out, wasn't really getting the same benefits. So what he saw were new forms of inequality developing in China. He thought that, this new sort of educated class was benefiting while everyone else wasn't, and they were sort of being held up above many of the people. Now, in order to fix this, by 1959, he comes up with this idea of the Great Leap Forward. And what he wants to do is he wants to industrialize the countryside and the cities at the same time. So here you'll see an image of backyard furnaces. And what they're doing is they're trying to produce steel in these furnaces. One of the goals of the Great Leap Forward was to surpass the United Kingdom in steel production in 15 years, and the United States in something like 25 years. Unfortunately, it's hard to produce quality steel in a backyard furnace, and they didn't really produce anything of any quality in these furnaces. But the theory that Mao was operating on was that typically in sort of Marxist thinking is that you go across 4 specific stages. You go from sort of feudalism, capitalism, then to socialism, and then you end in communism. Mao was trying to jump past some of those stages and go straight to communism. Now, this is a relatively radical idea, and it doesn't work out well for China. So by 1962, you have the start of a massive famine that sort of rips through China. And depending on who you read, anywhere from 20 million to 40 million Chinese people lost their lives as a result of this famine. Additionally, one of the issues that this causes is this starts a breakdown with relations with the Soviet Union. And the dispute was based on ideology. And this is how we get into sort of the international sort of aspects that lead us to 1972. So the Soviets, when Mao deviates from that sort of those 5-year plans and those ideas of focusing on heavy industry, what he's doing is he's deviating from the Soviet model. And his Soviet friends and partners in the Soviet Union are saying, hey man, what are you doing? It's not gonna work. You gotta get back to what we were doing. But when Mao refuses, the relationship between the Soviet Union and China splits. So things come to a head on July 18th, 1960. The Soviet Union in the 50s had sent a bunch of advisors and aid to China to help build up its economy in the 1950s. That was a part of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. Now, the Soviet Union recalls those advisors in 1960 because they are so disgusted with what they're seeing in China. And this really starts a major schism in the communist bloc. Whereas before, I think for much of this time, the United States is viewing the sort of communist bloc as a monolithic whole. The Soviets and the Chinese are connected inexorably. You can't break them apart. But what the US is not noticing, at least initially by 1960, is they're not noticing that this schism is taking place. So you guys might be wondering, how bad does the relationship between the Soviet Union and China get? It gets really bad. So by the late 1960s, you start to have Sino-Soviet border skirmishes taking place. And these skirmishes tended to take place in sort of 2 particular areas. There's in the northeast, what the Chinese refer to as Dongbei, and in the far west, what the Chinese refer to as Xinjiang. Now, there's a little bit of contested territory right around here, and that's where some of the first fighting begins in 1969. And you have hundreds of soldiers that lose their life on both sides of this conflict. And you also, in that same year, have another sort of really big and significant border clash in Xinjiang. Now, to explain to you how sort of meaningful these things were for the relationship between China and the Soviet Union was that one day in Washington, a Soviet diplomat sits down with an American diplomat and says, how would you feel if the Soviet Union were to bomb nuclear facilities in the People's Republic of China? And obviously that American diplomat nearly dropped his fork, spit out his food, and was like, what are you talking about? But they were really considering a preemptive strike on nuclear facilities in China. And you can obviously think about the ramifications of making such a move. So this brings us back to our strategic triangle, right? Now you've got the United States, China, Soviet Union, China, but that connection has been severed. And by severing that connection, that means that the situation has to change and there's opportunity. Now, in 1967, 68, Mao turns to 4 of his marshals, 4 of his top military leaders. And he says, listen, guys, I need you to produce a report covering sort of the international situation, the current situation in the Cold War between sort of the US, the Soviet Union, and where do we fit in all of this? And eventually, this guy here, Chen Yi, goes to Mao and he says, listen, what we need to do is resolve the issues that we have with the United States. Because really, by the late 1960s and into the early 70s, the Soviets had started to replace the United States as the chief enemy of the Chinese people. Now, so what do, right? And I think a lot of us think about that moment, right? 1972. But in reality, they had been working towards that moment since the late 1960s. By about 1968 is when things start. And that puts us on the road to Sino-US rapprochement. Now, this road for the US on our side of things begins really in 1967. And that's even before Nixon becomes president. So Nixon in 67 is on the record as saying, taking a long view, we simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations. They're to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, and threaten its neighbors. There's no place on this small planet for 1 billion of its potentially most able people to live in angry isolation. And the Chinese sort of diplomats, they pick up on this. They know that Nixon has made this statement in 1967. And we'll start to get US and Chinese ambassadorial talks beginning in 1968. And as you all know, all of us who lived through this event, Nixon was elected president in 1968. And his speech was maybe the first presidential speech in quite some time. His inauguration speech was one of the first speeches in a long time that was actively sort of circulated in the People's Republic of China. And one thing that was weird about this is, right, there's the usual rhetoric of like, anti-US rhetoric that had become a sort of part and parcel of the discussions at the time in China, but they didn't write anything that was very critical of Nixon himself in a lot of these reports, right? So something was starting to shift. Now, contact started once again after those ambassadorial talks in 1968. It begins again in 1969. But the weird question is, how does the US, who now under Nixon is eager to sort of reset relations with China, how do you get a hold of China? Because you guys have been at each other's throats for so long. By 1969, there are no official channels connecting the US and China. So in order for Nixon to get China's attention, he has to go through 2 other countries to make it happen. He has to go through Pakistan and Romania, who have good relationships with China. So they go to those 2 countries and say, hey man, do you mind passing on a word? Do you mind telling the Chinese that we're very interested in having talks with them again about normalizing relations? And obviously, in China, this is received pretty well, but it doesn't move anything just yet. So then we have a US diplomat, Walter Stossel, who meets with Lei Yang in 1970. And they talk about the sort of beginning of bridging those relationships once again. And one of the major sort of sticking points that they have to negotiate around, and this is probably the primary sticking point, is the issue of Taiwan. So remember I'd talked about that civil war that took place from late 1920s all the way to 1949 between the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists. Well, the communists, although they were initially smaller, they ended up winning that conflict, but they weren't able to completely eliminate the nationalists. They simply forced them off of the Chinese mainland to this island of Taiwan. And for a long time, the United States supported Taiwan as the one and only China. Even though like this is a really big country over here, and Taiwan is a relatively small island. But they were the one true China in the US eyes, right? And the US had helped Taiwan maintain control over their seat in the United Nations up until the early 1970s. But for China, this is the paramount issue. The Communist Party in China desperately wants to have sort of reunification with Taiwan. And this is a very short distance across this strait here. It's probably roughly 90 miles from the Chinese coast to Taiwan. But before the Chinese were going to be willing to meet with any sort of US diplomats in an official capacity, they wanted to make sure that this was an issue that they could discuss, the sort of status of Taiwan. And additionally, one big issue was that the United States maintained military bases on the island. And for China, they were worried about sort of having those US arms and armaments that close to the Chinese mainland. And, you know, leaders in China wanted to also, you know, after having that sort of initial discussion, they wanted to signal to the United States that they were willing to also sort of have a conversation, and a high level conversation. So Mao invites an old friend back to China by the name of Edgar Snow. So Snow is pictured here meeting with Mao, and I think this is in the early 1970s. Years ago, back when the Chinese Communist Party were a really small group clinging to life in parts of China under the sort of nationalist onslaught, he wrote a book called Red Star Over China. And this book was instrumental in sort of changing the world's view of the Chinese communists and really elevated Mao into sort of an important position in the world's sort of imagination. And they brought Edgar Snow back to do an interview with Mao once again. And he explains that, Mao explains to Edgar Snow that we'd be willing to meet with the Americans, and I think you should tell them that we'd like to meet with the president. I will host him in Beijing. So Edgar Snow is not able to sort of publish that sort of 1970s interview until 1972, but word got out. Obviously, somehow the US government finds ways to find out about these things. Word got back to them that Mao was willing to host Nixon in Beijing. Now, question goes, how do you warm relationships between two countries who've kind of been mortal enemies for the last 20 years, right? How do you get the Chinese people on board, and how do you get the American people on board? Because if you guys remember back to the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the US is fighting in Vietnam. And that's a conflict that is becoming increasingly unpopular as Americans are sort of watching it play out across their television screens. And then in China, you have the Cultural Revolution plunging the sort of country into chaos. Now, this Cultural Revolution begins in 1966, roughly. And this was Mao's way of getting back into power. If we think back to that, the famine that had taken place in the early 1960s, after that, a lot of people were like, Mao, your ideas are not particularly good. So they kind of sidelined him for a while. And this Cultural Revolution is what he used to get back into power. He mobilized the people, right, to bring him back into power, because he saw those changes that he was worried about in the 1950s. They started to creep back in the 1960s while he was sidelined, because the people who were sort of making those decisions in the 50s came back to stabilize the economy after it nearly collapsed during the Great Leap Forward. And what you end up having is an even more damaging movement for China. This is the movement that even the Chinese Communist Party's official history says is the most damaging sort of moment in the party's history post-1949. And it shuts down the country. It barely functioned from 1968 into the early 1970s. Universities weren't open. So against this backdrop, right, you've got this going on, and you've got the threat of the Soviets going on. And during this period in the Cultural Revolution, it's hyper anti-American, right? That's the enemy, still the enemy that they're hoping to deal with. And obviously with the Vietnam War raging, the US is used to thinking about the communist bloc. And obviously China is a North Vietnamese ally. So these are people who very much so see themselves on opposite sides of a battle. Now, the way that you bridge that gap, ping pong. I'm sure you all remember ping pong diplomacy. So in 1971, the ping pong world championships were being played in Nagoya, Japan. And the Chinese team was actually there. And this is a big deal because the Chinese team had not taken part in international competition for some time, but 1971 saw the return of the Chinese team. And if you know anything about ping pong, the Chinese players were the best in the world in 1971, and they're still the best in the world today. So the American team is also there in Nagoya, and there's a weird interaction that takes place between the Chinese and American teams. One day, one of the players on the American team accidentally gets on the Chinese bus, and everybody's like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? But really, you have these really cordial interactions that take place between those players. And after seeing those cordial interactions, Mao decides, let's invite the American team to play in China. And the US team arrives in China in 1971, a little bit after the World Championship. And this is a really big deal for changing how Chinese people thought about the Americans, right? This is the Americans coming to play ping pong in China, venturing into a space where China is unquestionably dominant. In this sport, they were the sort of experts and the world leaders. And the US sort of showed up and won some matches, but also lost quite a few. But this was a way in which they started to change those ideas about the country, the United States. And shortly after that, in July of 1971, you have Henry Kissinger making his secret visit to the People's Republic of China. And in making this visit, they start to hammer out some of those issues between the US and China with regard to Taiwan. So sort of deviating from some earlier statements, Kissinger explains that the US is ready to discuss the issue of Taiwan. Whereas previously, US administrations were not willing to sort of discuss that issue or entertain the idea. But by signaling that they're ready to discuss the issue of Taiwan, that paved the way for Nixon's visit on February 21st in 1972. And of course, he stays for the week. Now, in this discussion, China and the United States come to the agreement that, one, the US says, okay, Taiwan is a part of China. But what we want from you all is the agreement that China and Taiwan will be unified peacefully and not through the use of force. And this is enough to sort of bridge the divide between the two. And the US commits to removing its military hardware and personnel from Taiwan gradually over the next few years. And at the end, in February 28th, 1972, they released the Sino-American Joint Communique. And this sort of doesn't talk about, a lot of hard decisions or deals, but it sort of is a joint statement that says we are here to cooperate moving forward. So what did China and the US gain, or what did they want from making this decision, right? China, if you remember, is dealing with the Sino-Soviet split. And they are very worried about the Soviet Union. So by making this agreement with the United States, what they've done is they've reshaped those battle lines in the communist bloc. And now they've sort of managed to regain a bit of the upper hand. They believe the Soviet Union would not dare strike into China now that it's sort of got a budding relationship with the United States. And the United States needed a way to sort of get out of that conundrum that we had found ourselves in the Vietnam War by establishing better relations with China, Nixon felt that this was going to be a way to sort of open up that door to exiting the Vietnam War, or at least making it easier to exit from Vietnam. But not everybody was on board with this. Some people kind of saw this as betrayals all around. Obviously, if you're the Vietnamese and you find out that Nixon's coming to China, you're very shocked. If you're in North Vietnam, you're saying, hey, guys, what gives? You're supposed to be our friends, and now you're inviting our sworn enemy, who we're currently fighting and dying against, to your country? Real weird. Some of the US allies, Japan, was upset that they weren't consulted in the lead up to this sort of fixing the relationships between China and the US, because Japan, as a firm US ally, had not traded extensively with China for years. And that means years of missed out, economic opportunities. So the Japanese were very, taken aback by this step and caught off guard. You also have, those dissidents, right, who had traveled to China, supported China throughout the 1950s and 1960s, like Robert F. Williams, who now, we had come there to collaborate with you sort of against the United States, and now we're finding out that you're going to be friends with the United States. And one interesting thing for Williams is he comes back to the United States in 1969, and in the early 1970s, he's like, guys, I need some help doing something. There's some stuff going on that I really disagree with. So he sort of reaches out to Mao, and Mao's secretary replies, like, our relationships with the US are really getting better. So, we're not really interested in helping you out right now. Maybe we'll help you out a little later. And if you can, try to maintain good relationships with the US government. So the relationship had changed between China and even those dissidents. And that it helps to explain why this was such a big moment between the two countries. And the relationships since then, right? Post Nixon's visit, China and the US had increasing contact. If you look at materials from China on the US in like the 1970s and early 80s, they're much, 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 much more positive than they were in the years before. And because you have this increased contact, there's a lot more understanding between the US and China. So Deng Xiaoping comes to power in 1978, and he begins sort of what we know as China's economic miracle. And this was fueled in part by sort of the renewed good relationships with the US and the West. So China gets an infusion of technology, factory, equipment, all of that sort of expertise that the West and some of its allies had built up now has an outlet in China. And from roughly the late 1970s into even the current century, they made good use of those investments. And China had the fastest growing economy really in the world for quite some time, up until the early years of the 21st century. So times were really good for a while, but there were always continued tensions. Taiwan, if you guys watch the news or listen to the news today, still a major issue. The sort of idea of peaceful reunification maybe sometimes doesn't seem like a real possibility. And the US and China spar over Taiwan frequently. If you followed the events in Hong Kong, recently you had the umbrella protest where pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong sort of fought back against some legal changes that were being made in Hong Kong. And that was another flashpoint that created tension between the US and China. And of course, the Tiananmen Square protest on June 4th, 1989 was another one of those really big points of tension between the US and China. But for a long time, right, from the 70s and 80s, it was really they were in that frenemy zone. We disagree on a lot of things, but the relationship between us remains good because there are benefits for both of us. But recently, those things have sort of started to change. If you guys have followed the Olympics, President Putin was in Beijing, and he met with his counterpart Xi Jinping, and they expressed that the ties between the the ties between China and Russia were unlimited. So that strategic triangle that we talked about before is sort of starting to come back together with regards to Sino-Russian ties. And you do see a lot more of these sort of negative discussions of the United States in a lot of Chinese media. So, you know, in a weird sense, relationships between the two countries have been better. And really, the administrations, the previous administration and Xi Jinping were two very sort of protectionist and nationalistic sort of administrations. So having those sort of orientations, they often butted heads. And that really ratcheted up the sort of tension between the two countries, which culminated obviously in the trade war of the sort of, you know, from 2016 to 2020 between the US and China. So the question then that I want to leave you all on is, what do you do? What can we do to sort of fix this relationship? What does it need? And I would say, in a very limited scope, this relationship needs somebody like Richard Nixon. And this is probably the first and last time you will ever hear anyone say, we need Richard Nixon, right? Now, this is a very limited need. We need like not Watergate, but just someone who's open, right, to bridging those divides. And you obviously need someone on the other side, which it's odd to say, Mao in the early 1970s was open to bridging the divides. So in a weird way, we need Richard Nixon. Now, the benefit on both sides, if we do manage to sort of build back those relationships and those bridges, is what I call the Rush Hour 2 effect. Could have gone with Rush Hour 1, but I couldn't find a good image. The point is that when China and the US cooperate, we get really awesome stuff like Rush Hour. So on that note, that concludes the discussion. And I think you all will have sort of ideas of, you know, what were Sino-US relationships like before 1972? What was the significance of Nixon's visit to China? And how have those relationships evolved from 72? Currently bad, but I have hope that they'll get better in the future. So on that note, I'll answer any questions that you might have. Yeah.
Russia and China, they're back together now, kind of.
Yeah, kind of, sort of, yeah.
What's that all about? I mean, what's pulling them together?
You know, I think that they have similar worldviews sort of at the moment. There's a lot of tension. You know, the sort of political systems in China and Russia have some similarities. But, you know, importantly, they also have similar sort of views of who they think are people that are antagonistic towards them, right? So this idea that the US is trying to box in not only China, but also Russia leads to this sort of similar understanding or worldview that kind of helps bring those two together. So, you know, it's not, I don't want to say it's the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but it's something close to that that's bringing sort of China and Russia back together. And really, I think that, you know, obviously the idea of like a strategic triangle is, you know, it's an interesting way of looking at things, but, you know, ideally, we find ourselves in a place where, you know, you're not trying to isolate one of these three members and you have a lot more cooperation globally, because, you know, after the last few years, you know, we could all use a little bit more of that. Yeah, any other questions?
So the 1972
It was the agreement was that there was only one China, and that the unification of China and Taiwan will be done peacefully. and this is one thing that I always say, right, is that what do we mean when we say unification? Because I think ideally, right, if you were to unify Taiwan and China, there's give and take. You know, it's not just we're absorbing you, right? It's you have these two places coming together and really coming together, right? And you have these, because they're very different political systems. And the question is, how do you bridge those differences? And it can't be that you sort of just dictate to China or dictate to Taiwan, this is how things are going to be. There has to be real cooperation. But over the previous years, they've moved further and further away from that recently. Yeah.
So if you have a Nixon, then you need a Kissinger. And if you have a Kissinger, what is the message that he would take that could potentially divide a more unified set of interests between Russia and China?
Now, that's a really hard question to answer. And I will say this, you know, I don't want to run too far with the we need another Nixon and another Kissinger take, but I would say this. If I had that answer, I'd probably be in DC somewhere making it happen. But I don't know. I don't know. You know, I just hope that someone can find a way to not only do something similar, but to do it better than even we did in the past. Because, you know, there were places where we could have, you know, done better. Any other questions? Well, I do want to ask one question of the audience before we wrap up. And that is, what do you remember from, you know, seeing that visit, if you remember it in 1972? And sort of what did it mean to you at that time? Do any of you remember sort of seeing Nixon land in Beijing? All right, let's come to Mark. And then was that a yes? Yeah. So let's start with Mark. Yeah.
I don't think I was international enough to really think that it mattered one way or the other. It was an event, and everybody knew Nixon was up for re-election, and the visit to China was key to his re-election bid. So I think, at least my own feeling was that was a little like his handling in Vietnam. It was all political and had less to do with China than it had to do with Nixon.
I think that's a really strong point, you know, because Nixon really in his mind was like, this is my chance to really put my stamp on the book. You know, if I can bring the United States and China back together, that is a really bold political statement to make in that moment. So I think you're right. There was a very real political calculation that was made at that time. And I think the last thing I'll say is, you know, there was a lot of positivity to it, especially in those first couple of decades. And, you know, I'd say relations are as fraught as they've been in quite some time. So, you know, our hope is that we can bring a little bit more positivity back to that relationship. And on that note.
Oh, actually, we have a quick question from the virtual audience. What is your take on the momentous change in Hong Kong, and what, if any, implications may that have for Taiwan?
Oh, yeah, that's a real loaded question. So the changes in Hong Kong have been really quite significant. And I wrote a piece for Origins that talked about sort of what those changes meant, right? Because Hong Kong had been a British colony since the 19th century, and they had agreed to return Hong Kong in 1997. And there was supposed to be a gradual sort of unification of the laws and ideas between the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong. But one thing that I pointed out was that Hong Kong, the people living there, many of them had sort of had this opportunity to build up a sort of different identity over those long sort of years as a British colony. And sort of a lot of the political views that existed in Hong Kong were very different from those that existed in the PRC. And, you know, I think the way that the sort of unification of Hong Kong and the PRC played out recently was really unfortunate, because this goes back to that idea, right, of what I talked about before of sort of real give and take. And it's not really just an imposition because what seems to have been is that there was a lot more imposition than there was give and take on this. And the unfortunate side effect of that, right, is that if you are someone who's living in Taiwan, that raises your sort of doubts about what it means to reunify with the PRC. So rather than sort of them seeing that and promoting this idea of like, hey, you know what, if we reunify, it's going to be okay because there's going to be a lot more give and take. I think the message that a lot of people in Taiwan took from the events in Hong Kong, at least clearly the Taiwanese government, what they took from that was that it wouldn't be reunification in the spirit of give and take. It would be more of an imposition. And I think if China wants to get back to square one with Taiwan, they'll have to sort of address that issue. That'll be one of the first roadblocks that'll have to go down before peaceful reunification will be possible.
Question, actually. China has been investing a lot in countries in Africa and South Asia. Does that mean we as a country are losing the status of being the world leader?
That's a really interesting question. And I think it depends on how much, the US and other people around the world are willing to engage with, specifically countries in the global South. So countries in Africa, South America. I think that if done right, this is something that should be positive for people living in the global South. So if you're getting sort of US investment, you're getting Chinese investment, this should be something that rises and lifts up everyone. But you can run into issues when you have this really, this politicization of the sort of outreach, right? Because what happens there is that you have states, be it the US or China or any sort of state in the global South or really anywhere, rather than making decisions that are sort of built around what's best for people on the ground, they're making decisions that are more tied to these political ideologies that sometimes have grounding in reality and sometimes are not all that well grounded in reality. And what that can lead to is states that are taken advantage of. So I think, if we can get to the place where people are really engaging with each other on the basis of sort of transparency and equality, then what you end up having is sort of relationships that are in particular better for states that are in the global South, because right now, a lot of the way that it's presented is people have to pick or choose, right? It's like, are you going to do the US thing or the European thing or the Chinese thing? And in reality, everyone should be really investing in one another and benefiting. Yes, there's also the questions of enormous debt that can be taken up. And, you shouldn't take on debts thinking, hey, this is just on the good word of a friend and ally because they are like us and they're doing the right thing for us. And really, no, you have to pay attention to the finances and to all those things because, these states are going to be acting in their own interest. And it's best that everyone sort of is very upfront and clear about what their interests are in those interactions. One more question? Oh, we're all set. Okay, thank you all.